Thank you so much for finding Miracle English. I hope you enjoy listening and have a wonderful time. Cinderella. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Talked to Stars. Once upon a time, in a quiet kingdom nestled between tall green mountains and a sparkling silver sea, there lived a girl named Cinderella. She had eyes the color of the morning sky, and hair as soft and golden as summer wheat. But more than her beauty, what made Cinderella truly extraordinary was her heart. She was kind to every creature she met. She spoke gently to the mice that scurried through the kitchen walls. She saved crumbs for the sparrows that tapped at the windowsill. She even whispered good morning to the flowers in the garden, as if they could hear her. And perhaps, in some magical way, they could. Cinderella lived in a large and beautiful house at the edge of a village. The house had tall white walls, a garden full of roses, and a fountain where goldfish swam in lazy circles. It had once been a happy place. When Cinderella was very small, her mother had filled the house with music and laughter. Her mother sang while she cooked. She danced in the garden when the rain fell. She told Cinderella stories every night before she slept. But Cinderella's mother became ill one winter, and she passed away like a candle going quietly out in the dark. Cinderella cried for a long time after that. Her father, a good but grieving man, tried his best to care for her. But his sadness made him weak, and after 2 years, he brought home a new wife, believing she would help care for the home and for his daughter. That decision changed everything. The new stepmother was a tall, narrow woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She had 2 daughters of her own named Anastasia and Drizella, who were loud, selfish, and incredibly mean. From the very first day they arrived, Cinderella could feel that something had shifted in the air of the house. Like a cold wind blowing through a room where the fire had just gone out. The stepmother smiled often, but her smile never reached her eyes. "What a lovely child," she said when she first saw Cinderella, running one cold finger along the girl's cheek. "How pretty. How very, very pretty." Cinderella smiled back politely. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind outside, she felt a small and quiet worry settle in her chest. Chapter 2. When the House Changed. Cinderella's father died the following spring. He had been growing thinner and paler all winter, and one gray morning in April, he simply did not wake up. Cinderella sat beside his bed for a long time, holding his cold hand, listening to the silence where his breathing had been. She did not cry right away. She was too shocked for tears. But later, when the house was dark and everyone else had gone to sleep, she crept out to the garden and sat beneath the old oak tree where her mother's grave was marked with a small white stone. And there, in the dark, with the stars listening above her, she cried until she had no more tears left. "I am alone now," she whispered to the stars. But somehow, looking up at those cold bright points of light, she felt as though someone was listening. After her father's funeral, the stepmother's mask of kindness slipped away entirely, like a coat being thrown aside on a warm day. She called Cinderella into the main hall and looked at her with those sharp, calculating eyes. "This house belongs to me now," the stepmother said. "And you will earn your place in it." From that day forward, Cinderella was given no servants, no tutor, and no comfort. She was given instead a mop, a broom, a bucket, and a long list of chores that grew longer each morning. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. She hauled water from the well before dawn. She cooked breakfast for the whole household and was not allowed to eat until everyone else had finished. She washed the laundry by hand in freezing cold water. She polished the silver, swept the chimneys, and ironed the endless, ridiculous ruffles on her stepsisters' dresses. And all of this she did without complaint. Not because she was weak, but because she had made a promise to herself, in the dark under the oak tree, the night her father died. She had promised that no matter what happened, she would not let them take her kindness away. Her kindness was the last thing that was truly hers. And she was going to keep it. Chapter 3. Friends in Small Places. As the months went by and the years slowly passed, Cinderella found friendship in unexpected places. There was Jacques, a small gray mouse with bright clever eyes, who lived in the wall near the kitchen fireplace. He had first appeared on a cold night when Cinderella had left a piece of bread near the hearth, too tired to put it away. She had watched him creep out, take the bread, and look up at her with those sharp little eyes, as if studying her. "You are welcome," she had whispered, not knowing quite why. After that, Jacques returned every evening. He would sit near her feet while she worked, and sometimes she talked to him, telling him about her day. She knew he could not understand her words. But somehow, his presence made the long evenings less lonely. There was also Gus, a rounder, lazier mouse who had arrived one summer morning when Cinderella left a piece of cheese unguarded for half a moment. Gus was not clever like Jacques. But he was warm and loyal, and he always seemed to appear when Cinderella looked especially sad. There were birds, too. A family of bluebirds that nested in the eaves above her small attic room. They would sing in the morning and sometimes land on her windowsill while she got dressed, chirping as though they were commenting on her day. Cinderella talked to all of them. She talked to the animals because she had no one else to talk to. Her stepsisters treated her with open contempt. They called her names. They ruined her work on purpose, spilling things she had just cleaned, tearing things she had just mended. Ordering her to do the same tasks over again with cold smiles on their faces. The stepmother was worse in a quieter way. She never screamed or threw things. She simply looked at Cinderella with those measuring eyes, as if calculating exactly how much she could take from the girl before breaking her entirely. But every night, before she slept, Cinderella would go to her tiny window and look up at the sky. And she would remember her mother's voice saying, "The stars are always watching, my love. They see everything. And one day, they will answer." She held onto those words the way a drowning person holds onto a branch. Chapter 4. The Royal Invitation. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a royal messenger in a gold and blue uniform who trotted up the road on a white horse. Cinderella was in the garden, hanging laundry, when the messenger blew a short trumpet blast and held up a sealed envelope bearing the royal crest. By royal decree, the messenger announced loudly, "All eligible young women in the kingdom are hereby invited to attend the grand royal ball to be held 3 days hence at the palace. The crown prince seeks a bride. All young women of the realm are commanded to attend." The stepsisters came screaming out of the house before the echo had even faded. A ball. At the palace. The prince. A bride. They were tripping over each other's sentences, pink-faced and trembling with excitement. The stepmother accepted the invitation with a controlled smile and sent the messenger on his way. Then she turned to look at Cinderella, who was still standing by the laundry line, a wet shirt in her hands. "You," the stepmother said, "will stay home." Cinderella's heart sank. "But the decree says all young women of the realm. Surely I am included. I am of this household and of eligible age." The stepmother's eyes narrowed. "You have no gown. You have no shoes. You have no time, as you will be busy with your chores. And you are in no condition to appear before a prince." She looked Cinderella up and down with that sharp, cold gaze, then turned and walked back into the house. Cinderella stood there for a long moment, holding the wet shirt, feeling the familiar weight of unfairness pressing down on her chest. Then she took a breath, pinned the shirt to the line, and went back to work. But that evening, sitting alone in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed, she allowed herself to cry. "Just a little. Just for a moment. I just want one evening," she whispered. "One evening to be something other than a servant. Just one." The mice watched her from the shadows. Jacques tilted his little head. Chapter 5. The Fairy Godmother. The next 2 days were a storm of preparation for the stepsisters. Cinderella mended their gowns, curled their hair, polished their shoes, pressed their gloves, sewed on buttons that had come loose, and listened to their endless, deafening chatter about the prince. "He is tall," Anastasia said dreamily. "He is rich," Drizella said more practically. "He will choose me," they both said simultaneously, and then glared at each other. Cinderella said nothing. She just sewed. On the evening of the ball, Cinderella helped the stepsisters dress and did their hair and fastened their necklaces and handed them their fans. Then she watched the carriage roll away down the road toward the golden lights of the palace in the distance. She stood in the doorway for a long time after the carriage had gone, watching the dust settle, listening to the silence. Then she went into the garden. She sat down on the old stone bench near her mother's oak tree and looked up at the stars, which were especially bright and numerous that night, as if the sky had been washed clean. She did not speak for a while. She just looked. Then, very quietly, she said, "I wish I could go. Just this once." The garden was silent. And then it was not. There was a soft sound, like wind moving through leaves, except there was no wind. And then a warm golden light began to glow between the oak tree's roots, growing slowly brighter, until Cinderella had to shield her eyes. When the light faded, a woman was standing in the garden. She was older, with a round kind face and bright twinkling eyes and silver hair coiled up under a wide-brimmed hat, from which small stars seemed to drift like snowflakes. She wore a lavender cloak and carried a long wand that caught the moonlight. She looked at Cinderella with an expression of immense warmth and a kind of ancient knowing. "Well," said the woman, brushing a star off her sleeve. "Here we are at last." Cinderella stared. "Who are you?" "I am your fairy godmother," the woman said simply, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "And I have been watching you for a very long time, my dear." "You have been watching me?" Cinderella looked confused. "Why?" The fairy godmother smiled. "Because kindness like yours does not go unnoticed. Not by the stars. Not by me. Now then, you wish to go to the ball." Cinderella straightened. "I do not have a gown. Or shoes. Or a carriage." "No," the fairy godmother agreed cheerfully. "You do not. But I do. Or rather, I have something better." I have magic." And then she laughed, a warm rolling laugh that sounded like bells, and raised her wand. Chapter 6. Magic and Moonlight. The fairy godmother pointed her wand at the old pumpkin sitting forgotten by the garden fence. There was a flash of warm gold light, a sound like a chord of music, played by an invisible orchestra, and the pumpkin swelled and transformed and shifted until it stood before them as a magnificent carriage. It was gold and white, with glass windows that caught the moonlight and wheels that seemed to be made of spun silver. Cinderella gasped. The fairy godmother was already moving, waving her wand toward the garden, and 4 white mice, including Jacques and Gus, became 4 magnificent white horses that stamped their hooves and tossed their manes and looked entirely pleased with themselves. 2 lizards from the garden wall became footmen in gold livery. An old horse in the stable became a coachman who adjusted his hat with great dignity. Then the fairy godmother turned to Cinderella herself. "Now for the most important part," she said with a smile. She raised her wand and pointed it at Cinderella. The light that followed was not gold but silver, cool and flowing, like moonlight turned liquid. Cinderella felt it wrap around her like warm water, and when she looked down, the worn and patched dress she had been wearing was gone. In its place was a gown of the palest silver blue, so fine that it seemed to be made of starlight itself. It swept the ground like a gentle wave. It caught the moonlight and threw it back in 1,000 tiny reflections. It fit her perfectly, as though it had been made for no one else. On her feet were glass slippers, completely transparent, catching and scattering the light with every movement. Cinderella looked down at herself and then up at her fairy godmother, and for a moment she could not speak. "There is only one condition," the fairy godmother said gently, her voice losing its playful lilt and becoming serious. "All of this magic will end at midnight. At the last stroke of the clock, your gown will become your old dress again, your carriage will become a pumpkin, and your horses will be mice once more. You must leave the ball before midnight strikes. Do you understand?" Cinderella nodded. "I understand." "Good." The fairy godmother smiled again, warm and wide. "Now go, my dear. Enjoy this evening. It belongs to you. Every moment of it belongs to you." Cinderella climbed into the carriage. She looked out the window as the horses began to move, and she could see her fairy godmother standing in the garden, growing smaller in the distance, watching her go with that warm knowing smile. And for the first time in a very long time, Cinderella felt something she had nearly forgotten the name of. Hope. Chapter 7. The Palace. The royal palace was everything that a palace should be and more. It rose against the night sky like a crown, its towers topped with gold that caught the light of 1,000 torches. Its windows blazed with warmth and music poured from every one of them like water from an open tap. The courtyard was filled with carriages and horses and guests dressed in silks and velvets in every color of the rainbow. As Cinderella's carriage arrived, a herald in gold and blue bowed and opened her door. She stepped out onto the wide stone steps, and she felt the eyes of the crowd turn toward her. Not because she was trying to be noticed. She was not the kind of person who tried to be noticed. But there was something about her that drew the eye. Something in the way she moved, quietly and with an unforced grace, something in the calm warmth of her expression. And of course the gown, which caught the light in ways that seemed almost impossible, as though the stars had come down and wrapped themselves around her. A murmur moved through the crowd. Who is she? I do not recognize her. Is she from another kingdom? Cinderella heard none of this. She was too busy looking at everything around her with wide, wondering eyes. She had never been inside a palace before. The great hall was breathtaking. The ceiling soared above her like a sky made of painted gold and blue. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung overhead, dripping with candles that filled the room with a warm dancing light. An orchestra played at one end, the music rising and weaving through the crowd like something alive. Couples were already dancing on the gleaming marble floor. Cinderella stood at the edge of the room and simply breathed it all in. She did not notice the young man at the top of the grand staircase who had gone still the moment she walked in. But he noticed her. Chapter 8. The Prince. Prince Edward had been standing at the top of the stairs for an hour, looking down at the crowd with a politely pleasant expression that hid a profound and exhausted boredom. He had been introduced to more young women than he could count. They had curtsied and smiled and said exactly what they thought he wanted to hear. They had commented on the palace, on his uniform, on the loveliness of the evening. None of them had said anything real. Edward was 23 years old and he had learned early in his life that most people who spoke to him were not really speaking to him at all. They were speaking to his title and his crown. He had grown very tired of it. His mother, the Queen, had organized this ball with the best intentions. She wanted him to find a partner, someone to share his life with, someone who would one day help him rule wisely and well. He wanted that too. He simply doubted he would find it at a ball. And then she walked in. He saw her first from above, and what struck him was not the gown, though the gown was extraordinary. What struck him was her face. She was looking at the hall with an expression he had never seen before on anyone entering the palace. It was not calculation. It was not performance. It was genuine wonder, pure and unguarded, like a child seeing snow for the first time. She looked at the chandeliers with actual awe. She looked at the dancers with a small, genuine smile. She tilted her head slightly at the music as though she was really listening to it. She was not performing. She was just present. Edward was down the stairs before he quite knew he had decided to move. He crossed the room, and the crowd parted around him the way it always did, but he barely noticed. He walked up to the young woman in the silver blue gown. And she turned to look at him, and her expression did not change in the way everyone else's did when they recognized who he was. She just looked at him directly and naturally, as though he were simply another person. Which was, he realized with a jolt of surprise, exactly what he had always wanted. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. And for a moment neither of them said anything else. They just looked at each other. "I do not believe we have met," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "We have not. Would you like to dance?" he asked. She smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, not performed for his benefit. "I would like that very much," she said. Chapter 9. A Dance and a Conversation. They danced. And as they danced, they talked. Not about the palace. Not about his position. Not about the obvious things that everyone always talked about. They talked about the things that actually mattered to them. She asked him what he thought about when he looked at the stars at night. And he was so surprised by the question that he laughed, a real laugh, not the polite and careful kind he normally gave. "I think about how small everything seems," he said. And somehow that makes it easier to breathe. Yes, she said immediately, with the tone of someone recognizing something true. That is exactly it. She told him she liked the early morning best, when everything was quiet and the birds were just beginning. He told her he often snuck out of the palace before dawn to ride through the forest, because it was the only time he felt like no one was watching him. She told him she talked to animals. He told her he understood completely, and meant it. The music changed and they danced again, and the rest of the ball seemed to recede around them. The crowd and the noise fading to a distant murmur while the two of them existed in a small circle of clear and honest conversation. The stepsisters were somewhere in the room, Cinderella knew. She had caught a glimpse of Anastasia's orange gown and Drizella's green one. But they had not recognized her. She was not wearing her usual face, the tired, dust-smudged face they were used to seeing. She was wearing her real face, the one that only the stars and the mice and the birds had seen before. The prince led her out to the balcony between dances, where the night air was cool and the palace gardens spread below them in the moonlight. "I do not even know your name," he said, leaning on the stone railing and looking at her with a directness that she found she did not mind at all. "Does it matter tonight?" she asked. He considered this. "No," he said, "I suppose it does not. But I would like to know it all the same." She looked at him for a moment, then out at the moonlit garden. "My name is Ella," she said, using the name her mother had called her. "Ella," he repeated, as though tasting it. "I am Edward." "I know," she said. "You are the prince." "I am," he said. "But tonight, if you do not mind, I would like to just be Edward." She smiled at that, a warm and private smile that was the realest thing he had seen all evening. "I do not mind at all," she said. Chapter 10. Midnight. They did not notice the time passing. Time had a strange quality that evening, moving both too slowly and too fast, the way it does when you are in the middle of something you want to last forever. They had gone back to dancing, and then to talking, and then to dancing again. The prince had introduced her to no one. He had kept her entirely to himself, something that had caused considerable whispering among the court. The queen watched from across the room with a small smile. And then the great clock in the palace tower began to strike. 1, 2, 3. Cinderella heard it and the warmth drained from her face. 4, 5. She pulled back from the prince's arms, looking up at him with wide, suddenly panicked eyes. "I have to go," she said. 6, 7. "What? Now? Why?" He reached for her hand, looking genuinely alarmed. "Ella, what is wrong?" "I cannot explain. I am sorry. I am so sorry." She was already moving, backing away through the crowd, which parted around her in surprise. 8, 9. "Ella." His voice followed her. "Wait. Please." 10. She ran. 11. She ran through the great hall and through the doors and down the wide stone steps. Running as fast as she could in the glass slippers that rang on the stone like tiny bells. And on the 9th step from the bottom, her foot slipped and one glass slipper flew from her foot and tumbled down the steps. She had no time to stop. 12. The clock fell silent. She leapt into the carriage, which was already beginning to tremble and shift. The horses were stamping nervously. The coachman looked pale. "Go," she said, and the carriage lurched forward. She looked back through the rear window of the carriage as it rolled away from the palace at speed. She could see the prince standing at the top of the steps, staring after her, holding the glass slipper in his hands. She watched him until the palace disappeared around a curve in the road. And then she was alone in the dark carriage, and the gown was already fading. The silver light dissolving, becoming once again the worn and patched dress she had started the evening in. By the time the carriage reached the last bend in the road before her house, it was a pumpkin again, and she was sitting on the cold ground beside it in her old dress with one bare foot, the mice scattering away through the grass. She sat there for a long moment. Then she looked down at her one remaining glass slipper, still on her left foot. It had not disappeared. It caught the moonlight and threw it back at her, clear and cold and beautiful. She took it off carefully and held it in her hands. Then she walked home barefoot in the dark. Chapter 11. The morning after. The stepsisters came home from the ball in a foul mood. The prince had danced with no one but the mysterious woman in the silver gown. He had not danced with either of them even once. He had barely looked at them. She was nobody, Anastasia said bitterly, dropping into a chair. No one knew who she was. She must have been from some backwater province. She was wearing glass slippers, Drizella said, pulling off one of her own shoes and throwing it against the wall. What kind of person wears glass slippers? It is ridiculous. And she ran away at midnight, Anastasia added. Like a thief. She left her shoe behind and just ran. The prince was absolutely frantic. It was honestly rather embarrassing for her. Cinderella, who was serving them their tea, said nothing. She kept her face carefully neutral. But inside, in the part of her that she kept entirely to herself, something warm was still glowing from the evening before. She had danced with a prince. She had talked, really talked, with someone who listened. She had felt, for one evening, entirely and completely like herself. And even now, back in her old dress, with the cold floor under her feet and the stepsister's complaints ringing in her ears, she could still feel it. That warmth. That quiet glow. She tucked it away carefully inside her chest, like a candle protected from the wind by cupped hands. And she carried it with her through the long day that followed. That evening, she found Jacques sitting on her windowsill in the attic, looking at her with his bright eyes. "I know," she whispered to him. "It was only one night. And it is over now." Jacques tilted his head. "But it was real," she said. "And no one can take that away." Chapter 12. The search begins. The news came 3 mornings later. The herald was back, on the same white horse, with the same gold and blue uniform. This time his announcement was different. By royal decree, the crown prince will travel throughout the kingdom to find the young woman who attended the grand ball and departed before midnight. She left behind one glass slipper of extraordinary craftsmanship. The prince will visit every household in the kingdom. The young woman whose foot the slipper fits shall be presented to the crown as the prince's chosen bride. All households are commanded to present their eligible young women for the fitting. The stepsisters went absolutely wild. It is a glass slipper. All sizes look the same in glass. I can make my foot fit. I will make my foot fit if I have to. The stepmother, however, looked at Cinderella. Just looked at her, with those sharp, cold, calculating eyes. And something in those eyes told Cinderella that the stepmother knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to be dangerous. That evening, the stepmother locked Cinderella in the attic. "You will stay here," she said through the locked door, "until the prince's men have come and gone." "You cannot do this," Cinderella said. I am doing it, the stepmother replied, and Cinderella heard her footsteps walk away down the corridor. Cinderella stood in the middle of the small attic room and looked around her. She had the glass slipper. She had hidden it under the floorboard where she kept her mother's few remaining things, the portrait, the locket, the small worn book of poems. But the door was locked with a heavy bolt. And the window was 3 stories above the ground. She sat down on her small bed and looked at the locked door and at the window and at the floorboard beneath which the glass slipper lay waiting. Then she looked at Jacques, who was sitting in his usual spot by the window, watching her with those bright, clever eyes. I need your help, she said. Chapter 13. Friends come through. Jacques looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the gap beneath the door. Then he looked back at her and sat up very straight. Cinderella understood. The key is hanging in the hallway outside, she said carefully. On the hook by the staircase. Can you reach it? Jacques chattered softly. It will be heavy, she said. You will need Gus. Jacques looked briefly pained at the mention of Gus, who was not known for his speed or grace, but nodded. He disappeared under the door. Cinderella sat on the floor near the door, her heart pounding, listening to the distant sounds of the house below. She could hear the stepsisters arguing about which dress to wear. She could hear the stepmother's sharp footsteps going back and forth. She pressed her ear against the door. Nothing for a long time. And then a soft scraping sound. And then the key appeared in the gap beneath the door, pushed through with enormous effort and considerable squeaking by 2 very determined mice. Cinderella let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She picked up the key with trembling fingers. Thank you, she whispered, looking at the 2 mice who stood on the other side of the door watching her through the gap. Both of you. Thank you. She unlocked the door as quietly as she could. She retrieved the glass slipper from under the floorboard and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Then she crept out of the attic and down the stairs. She could hear voices at the front door. The prince's men had arrived. 14. The slipper fits. Cinderella came down the main staircase just as the royal herald was finishing his announcement in the entrance hall. The stepmother saw her first. Something moved in those sharp eyes, a flash of fury, but it was too late. The herald had also turned and seen Cinderella, and the duke who accompanied the royal party was already looking at her with curious eyes. All eligible young women of the household, the herald said carefully, looking from the stepmother to Cinderella. I am eligible, Cinderella said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised at how steady it was. The stepmother opened her mouth. She is a servant, the stepmother said. She is my stepdaughter, the stepmother said at exactly the same time, the 2 versions of the sentence colliding in the air. The duke looked at the stepmother. The stepmother closed her mouth. The herald presented the glass slipper on its velvet cushion. Anastasia had already tried to force her foot into it, turning red with effort, and had failed. Drizella had tried with equal determination and equal failure. Now Cinderella sat down on the chair that the herald offered her. She looked at the slipper on its cushion. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been missing for a long time. And then she slid her foot into it. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. The room went very quiet. Cinderella reached into her apron pocket and produced the matching slipper. She put it on her other foot. The duke stared at it for a long moment. Then he bowed. A proper, formal, respectful bow, the kind given to someone of considerable importance. "My lady," he said, "the prince has been looking for you." The stepsisters made sounds like deflating balloons. The stepmother said nothing at all. Cinderella stood up, and she walked to the front door and into the morning sunlight, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Chapter 15. A Reunion. The prince was waiting at the palace gates. He had insisted on being present for every household visit, over the considerable objections of his advisers who felt this was undignified and unnecessary. "I will know her when I see her," he had said simply, and that had ended the discussion. He had been waiting for 3 days. He had visited the homes of the highest noble families, the merchant houses, the craft guilds, the farming estates. Hundreds of young women had tried the slipper. None had fitted it, and now his carriage was rolling up the lane toward a large white house with tall walls and a garden. And he was looking out the window with the same careful attention he had given to every stop. He saw her the moment the carriage stopped. She was standing in the doorway. She was wearing a plain worn dress and her hair was pinned up simply, and she had flour on one sleeve from the morning's baking. But she was looking at the carriage with those eyes, those direct, unperforming, genuine eyes, and he recognized her instantly. Not because of the slipper. Because of her eyes. He stepped out of the carriage. She stepped forward. They stopped about 3 feet apart and looked at each other. "Ella," he said. "Edward," she said. He smiled. A real smile, not the public one. "I have been looking for you," he said. "I know," she said. "I was locked in my attic." He stared at her. "You were what?" "My stepmother," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has long since made peace with difficult facts. "She did not want me to be found." The prince looked at the door of the house, where 2 young women were staring at him with expressions of pure, horrified disbelief, and behind them, a tall narrow woman with a face like cold winter. His eyes returned to Cinderella. "How did you get out?" he asked. "My mice," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. That real laugh, the one that felt like bells. "Of course," he said. "Of course it was your mice." Chapter 16. What came next? There was a great deal that needed to happen before any talk of weddings. Cinderella was clear about this. The prince, who had expected to be clear about this himself and was pleasantly surprised to find she had beaten him to it, agreed immediately. "We have danced twice and talked for perhaps 4 hours total," she pointed out on the morning after the slipper fitting, when they were sitting in the palace garden. And he had somewhat impulsively begun talking about wedding arrangements. "That is true," he admitted. "You do not know me," she said. "Not really. You know the version of me that existed during one magical evening. That was a real version of me. But there are many other versions. I would like to know all of them," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then give me time. Come and find them. I am not going anywhere." So that was what they did. The prince came to visit her, not with royal ceremony and fanfare, but simply and quietly, the way he had once ridden through the forest before dawn to feel like himself. He came in the morning and sat with her in the garden while she talked to the birds. He came in the afternoon and they walked through the fields outside the village, while she told him about her childhood and her parents and what she had lost and what she had kept. He told her about the loneliness of being a prince, the way his title made a space around him that no one ever fully crossed, the way he had learned to smile. and wave and perform himself for the world while his actual self stayed somewhere quiet and hidden. "Until the ball," he said one afternoon, looking at her across the palace garden fountain where the goldfish swam in their lazy circles. "Until the ball," she agreed. He met Jacques and Gus. He sat very still while they climbed over his boots, which Cinderella found extremely endearing. He brought them cheese from the palace kitchens. Gus immediately became his devoted admirer. Jacques took somewhat longer, but eventually consented to eat cheese from the prince's hand, which Cinderella told him meant unconditional approval. She was moved into the palace in the meantime, officially as a guest of the crown. She had her own rooms, with high ceilings and wide windows that looked out over the palace garden. She had her own maids. This she found extremely strange for quite a long time. She kept trying to do things for herself and the maids kept gently redirecting her, looking somewhat alarmed each time she picked up a mop. Chapter 17. Kindness Remembered. One day Cinderella asked the prince what would happen to her stepmother and stepsisters. The prince had been thinking about this. He had thought about it quite a lot, in fact, particularly after learning in detail about the locked attic door and the years of cold servitude. "They have broken several royal laws," he said carefully. "Locking a citizen in her room to prevent her from responding to a royal summons is a serious offense. Treating an heir to property as an unpaid servant is another. I do not want them imprisoned," Cinderella said. He looked at her. "They made my life very hard," she said quietly. "But I do not believe making their lives hard in return will make anyone happier. Not them. Not me. Not you. Not the kingdom. What do you want for them, then?" he asked. She thought about it for a long moment. "I want them to understand what they did," she said. "Not because I need an apology. I have made my peace. But because I think they have never actually understood the consequences of their choices. They have never had to." "That is a very mature and rather generous position," the prince said. "It is a practical one," she said. "Bitterness is very heavy. I have been carrying too many heavy things for too long." So the stepmother was brought before the royal council and made to account for her actions. For the first time in her life she faced real consequences, and they were not violent or cruel, but they were firm and clear and unavoidable. The estate was returned to Cinderella, who had always been its rightful heir. The stepmother was required to leave. The stepsisters, who were less cruel than they were thoughtless and poorly raised, were sent to work for a year in the palace household. Not as servants but as helpers, where they were required to actually do things and actually see the people around them. It was, for both of them, a profound and uncomfortable experience. But Drizella, to everyone's surprise including her own, found that she was good at gardening. And Anastasia, even more surprisingly, discovered that she had a genuine gift for music. Neither of them was ever exactly kind. But they were somewhat less unkind than they had been. And sometimes, when she passed them in the palace corridor, Cinderella would smile at them. And sometimes, briefly, uncertainly, they would smile back. Chapter 18. The Fairy Godmother Returns. She appeared again on the night before the wedding. Cinderella was sitting alone in the palace garden in the dark, looking up at the stars the way she always had, the way she had done since she was a small girl sitting under the oak tree with her mother. The warm golden light appeared between the rose bushes, and the fairy godmother stepped out of it as though she had simply been waiting just around a corner. Well, she said, looking at Cinderella with those bright twinkling eyes. Here we are again. Here we are, Cinderella agreed. I have been wondering if you would come. Of course I came. I never miss a wedding. The fairy godmother settled herself on the stone bench beside Cinderella with a small contented sigh. How are you, my dear? I am happy, Cinderella said. It is a strange feeling. I have been happy in small moments before, but not like this. Not steadily. You deserve it, the fairy godmother said simply. I want to ask you something, Cinderella said. Ask. The magic. The gown and the carriage and all of it. Did you do it because you felt sorry for me? The fairy godmother looked at her with an expression of mild offense. I did it, she said firmly, because you had earned it. Every act of kindness you chose, day after day, in circumstances that would have made most people bitter. Every morning you got up and decided not to be cruel in return. That is not weakness. That is extraordinary strength. And strength like that deserves to be rewarded. Cinderella thought about this. I was not always strong, she said. There were many nights when I cried. Of course there were, the fairy godmother said gently. Crying is not weakness either. Crying means you still care. It is the people who stop caring who worry me. They sat together in the dark for a while, looking at the stars. Will I see you again? Cinderella asked. You will not need me again, the fairy godmother said. That is the best kind of answer. She stood up, straightening her hat which had drifted to one side, and brushed a star off her sleeve. Your mother would be so proud of you, she said quietly. She is watching, you know. They always watch. Cinderella felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not even known was tight. She looked up at the stars. I know, she said softly. I have always known. When she looked back, the fairy godmother was gone. Only a few drifting stars where she had been, settling gently into the grass like falling snow. Chapter 19. The Wedding Day. The morning of the wedding was clear and gold, the sky an unblemished blue, the air smelling of late summer and roses. The whole kingdom had been preparing for weeks. The village streets were hung with ribbons and flowers. The palace gates were open wide and the road from the village to the palace was lined with people who had come from every corner of the kingdom. They did not come just because a royal wedding was taking place. They came because of who was getting married. The story had spread quickly, as true stories always do. The girl who had been treated as a servant in her own home. Who had kept her kindness anyway? Who had gone to the ball and danced with the prince not because she was trying to ensnare him but because she had wished for one single evening of joy? Who had been locked in her attic and freed by her mice? People found that last part especially compelling. The crowd lining the road cheered when her carriage passed, not the polite ceremonial cheering of subjects performing loyalty, but the real, warm, spontaneous cheering of people who were genuinely glad. Cinderella looked out the window at the crowd and felt that strange steady happiness again, warm and solid in her chest. She was wearing a wedding gown of ivory and gold that had been made for her by the royal tailors over the past weeks. It was beautiful, but it was not magic. She had chosen that on purpose. On her feet she wore the glass slippers. She had asked to wear them, and the royal tailors had built the entire gown around them, which they found quite challenging and quite interesting. The palace chapel was full of light and flowers and music. Edward was waiting at the altar, and when she came through the doors and he saw her, his expression was exactly the same as it had been on the balcony at the ball. That direct, unguarded, completely real look. She walked down the aisle and took his hand. "Hello, Ella," he said softly. "Hello, Edward," she said. And they were married as the bells rang across the whole kingdom, from the highest tower of the palace, all the way to the smallest village at the edge of the mountains. Chapter 20. Happily, and with great effort, ever after. They were happy. This needs to be said clearly, because happiness of the real, lasting kind is not a thing that simply happens and stays in place. It takes work. It takes choosing, every day, to be kind and honest and present. It takes saying the hard things when the hard things need to be said, and listening carefully even when it is difficult. It takes knowing yourself well enough to know when you need to ask for help and being brave enough to actually ask. Cinderella and Edward were both, by nature and by long practice, good at all of these things. And so their happiness was real and sustained and, like all good things, grew larger over time rather than smaller. They ruled the kingdom together, and they ruled it well. Cinderella brought to the role of queen something that queens do not always bring, which was a genuine understanding of what it felt like to be the least powerful person in a room. She remembered what it was like to be invisible, to work hard and be unseen, to have your worth dismissed and your voice ignored. And so she made sure that the kingdom she helped govern was one where no one felt invisible. She created schools in every village. She established fair wages for household workers and craftspeople. She opened the palace gardens to the public on Sunday afternoons and could often be found there herself, talking with whoever came. The people loved her for all of these things. But mostly they loved her because when she spoke to you, she looked at you the way she had always looked at the mice and the birds and the stars. As though you were worth seeing. As though you mattered. Jacques and Gus lived in the palace walls and were given a special corner of the royal kitchens where cheese was always left for them. The bluebirds from the attic eaves migrated to the palace garden. The oak tree in the garden of Cinderella's old house was preserved by royal decree. And a small bench was placed beside it, and on the white stone beneath it new words were carved, added below her mother's name. They said she was right about the stars. And on certain evenings, when the palace was quiet and the day's work was done, Cinderella would go to the window of her study and look out at the sky, at those cold bright patient points of light. And she would feel her mother watching. And she would smile. And the stars, as always, smiled back. The end. Thank you for listening to Miracle English 3033. Keep reading, keep dreaming, and keep believing in your own magic.